Hi everybody and welcome to the Year 8 scheme overview for Term 1B on People and Power Poetry. I'm A.Potts, Director of Subject for NET, and this short video will give you an overview of this scheme. So first of all, it'll go into depth with regards to what the scheme actually looks like, how the scheme is broken down and linked together, and remembering the key message that poems are just texts. They are not to be feared. Often students are scared of poetry and inexperienced teachers are scared of poetry, but there is nothing to be scared of. And to reiterate the message that these poems should be seen as vehicles for knowledge and skills. When we work through these schemes, we're not focusing primarily on just teaching the text. It's about teaching the skills and the knowledge that go behind the actual text. So we're building and deepening transferable skills. And this slide gives us an overview of our English curriculum for this academic year, from Year 7 all the way through to Year 11. So you can see where this scheme fits in to the big picture. So we're on Term 1B and our Year 8 pupils will be focusing on poetry over time and specifically looking at the people and power poetry. For our Year 8 pupils, they will have studied poetry before last year in Term 1B when they looked at the Year 7 poetry anthology. This scheme builds on the skills that they demonstrated in that scheme. It builds on the poets that they were exposed to, and as well as linking backwards from year to year, it also links backwards term to term. So Year 8 have in the first term studied Othello. There will be concepts, skills and big ideas that they can transfer forward into this scheme. So let's take power for example. Year 8 at this point should be confident with this concept of a powerful individual, how people can lose their power, how they can be physically powerful but internally powerless, and how characters may abuse their power. And all of those concepts, big ideas, are applicable to this scheme. Take Dulce Decorum Est for example. We've got men presented as being powerless and they should actually be physically powerful. A parallel's drawn there between the representation of Othello in Iago. So we need to remember that the way that the NET curriculum works within English is that it's a spiral and that it builds on everything that's gone previous, and that we are not just teaching these core poems in terms of to allow our Year 8 students to know these poems incredibly well, but to deepen their analytical skills. So if we track poetry across our NET English curriculum, you can see that in Year 7 the students study 7 poems. In Year 8 that has increased to a potential 14 poems. Now the poems that are in red are the core poems, and these are the poems that have been chosen to be the core material within the curriculum, and the additional poems are there if needed. In Year 9 to 11, our students are expected to cover 15 poems. So you can see that's an incremental rise over the different elements of our 5-year curriculum. You will also notice that the poets that we expose our pupils to link to the poets that are from not just the literary canon, but also they are the GCSE poets as well, which means that from Year 7 our pupils are deepening their knowledge of context and big ideas surrounding power and conflict right from within Year 7. So if we take William Blake's The Poison Tree, And then if we think about in year 8, they study William Blake's Holy Thursday, and then ultimately in year 9 to 11, William Blake's London. Very similar threads and ideas are displayed throughout those 3 poems. And this is what the topic overview of the medium term plan actually looks like for year 8 poetry. And the first thing you're probably thinking is, why on earth is there an image of an onion on either side? And what I just want to quickly explain is how the English medium term plan has got different layers to it, and it's not just an overview document. We've then got the medium term plan week to week coverage, and then behind that we've then got the short term plan lesson to lesson coverage, and then behind that we've then got some skeleton lessons for you to refine and adapt and use as appropriately with your classes. So it's a multifaceted approach. So the first thing that you will notice is that this scheme builds from the Year 7 Power and Conflict anthology scheme, and it builds towards a power and conflict comparison that our pupils need to do at the end of their school career. There are also some core text and linked texts. So within this scheme, students don't just look at poetry, they look at all genres. Again, taken from significant members of our literary canon. So for example, for drama, we've got R.C. Sherriff's Journey's End. We've got Oh What a Lovely War to look at that element in that genre. We've then got links to prose, and importantly, we've got links to non-fiction writing, because that's the element that's normally missing from a curriculum perspective. So we've got that breadth. And again, I'm coming back to that idea of deepening and the curriculum being wide and covering all possible genres. We've then got the cultural heritage overview. So we can see that we are looking at poetry. We're looking at poetry right from the 16th century all the way to the 21st century. And with regards to our British values, we're looking at the ideas of democracy, individual liberty, mutual respect and tolerance. The next layer of the medium term plan is the section on conceptual threads. And I know many of you will have listened to my follow-up session on conceptual threading and continuity, and it's a really key part of teaching English in a successful way. So exposing our pupils to these big ideas and ultimately enabling them to build up the confidence and the skills to express their own big ideas. So no surprises that poetry deals with all of these concepts. It addresses every single area. And again, I just want to reiterate the idea that poetry should not be feared. It is something that we can really get to grips with and that we can really metaphorically dissect. I have placed the 4 main concepts along the bottom. So power, conflict, love and relationships. You cannot find a piece of literature that does not deal with these concepts. Every poem has links to these big ideas. That is why in the unseen poetry element of literature paper 2, the last section, the unseen poem that our year 11 pupils in our academies are exposed to is either a power and conflict poem or it's a love and relationship poem. So please, I'd encourage you to use these concepts as a crowbar into literature, but also poetry. And our pupils in year 8 at this moment in time should be more than confident with these conceptual ideas because they have been exposed to them in Othello. And this scheme is about building and deepening their understanding of these big ideas and how writers present them in literature. The next part of the medium term plan is the phased vocabulary. So you will see that we have included some of the dirty 30 words, and these are words that we would expect our pupils to be able to spell correctly. They are commonly misspelled, and the words that are in red are pieces of vocabulary that our pupils have been tested on at the end of Key Stage 2. Not necessarily in terms of the meaning, but definitely the spelling, so they should be familiar with them. We then have the Year 8 phased vocabulary for reading analysis. So for example, argument, shows, style, perspective, verbs for writer's intent and effect. And the whole idea of this section is when our pupils are writing about the text that they've been exposed to, that we give them these words as a framework to be able to actually analyse them. We've then also got some themed vocabulary, words that are really important for this scheme, words that build up from the Year 7 scheme, but also vocabulary that builds upon the Shakespeare Year 8 scheme that our pupils have just covered. So the idea is that through every scheme, the vocabulary builds up. We also have phased content. So going into Year 8, at this moment of time, you can see that there are 3 areas that we would expect to be taught throughout this scheme: context, terminology and technical elements, and key concepts. And what you will also find is that in the scheme we have included the phased content from Year 7. So it may be, if you are teaching a Year 8 lower ability class, you might draw on the phased content from Year 7 to make your lesson more appropriate and to close that gap a little bit further. So from Year 8, within these lessons, all of these bullet points have been covered. From views of the other, from modern conflict, all the way down to the idea of the objectification of people and the power of individuals, like I've previously mentioned. Again, the key concepts are intended to build on the key concepts that have been taught throughout Year 7. So rather than just talking about the consequences of conflict, we also talk about the impact of events on individuals emotionally and psychologically. And you can see that it builds up. At the bottom, there is also some wider reading recommendations, some options from the classic and the modern genre, and again covering different elements of genres, from plays to autobiographies, another poetry anthology to some novels. And this is the second layer of our medium-term plan onion, so to speak. So the slides that I've just taken you through, the different segments, the things like the phased vocabulary, the phased content, the conceptual threads, the wider reading links, they make up the first couple of pages for the medium-term plan. And this is the 3rd page. And this page offers weekly focus and coverage, but it also gives individual lesson focus, but also reinforces the requirement for retrieval focus and also opportunities for interleaving to be deepening and building on those skills constantly. So if we look at week 1 together first, we'll see that the core text is Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est, and as an additional text we've got the non-fiction extract from Robert Graves, which was identified as one of the additional texts to use within the scheme. The first lesson is a guided reading of Dulce et Decorum Est. The second lesson is analysis of Dulce et Decorum Est. The third lesson is context and wider discussion, bringing in that additional text if appropriate. And then the fourth lesson is review and assessment, and it's an extended real exam time task. So for example, in week 1, this suggested real exam time task is comparing perspectives between Owen and Graves and reintroducing the element of the peel. If we look at retrieval focus, I'm expecting pupils to be able to retrieve semantic fields, but also the content of the poems between the lessons. Opportunities for interleaving include making conceptual links from Poetry Year 7 and Othello Year 8, really zoning in on those ideas of power and conflict, and also an opportunity to refer back to particular skill deficits from writing pale paragraphs in the Othello scheme from the previous term. So you can see that this is a continuous process. We are not just teaching these texts as individual things. The links between them are fluent. If we move on to week 2, the core poem is Carol Ann Duffy's The Last Post and Beatrice Garland's 9/11 The Aftermath. There is an additional text, and again it's a non-fiction text in this instance, with The Last Fight in Tommy. Now what you will notice from week 2 onwards is that the first lesson is always entitled Recap of Previous Week, Skills Application and Vocabulary. And the expectation is in the first lesson of the week that individual class teachers have identified a gap in skills or knowledge from the previous week, and they address that within that lesson before moving on to the new weekly focus. So this is now the short-term plan. So we've gone from the medium-term plan, first 2 covering sheets, then the weekly overview, and then this is an additional layer where each week is broken down following the weekly focus, but then there is a skeleton lesson planned for you. So this is week 1, and the weekly focus is Wilfred Owen, Dulce Decorum Est, and then we've got the additional non-fiction text from Robert Graves. We've got the focus, which links back to the content overview. That lesson 1 is about reading and understanding Dulce Decorum Est, and lesson 2 is about analysing Dulce Decorum Est. So we've got the building of skills throughout the week. Just want to draw your attention to the Aspire and Challenge objectives. They use the Bloom's taxonomy, but I also want to make it explicitly clear that if you've got a really able class, to just explain might not be appropriate for your Aspire. You might actually be dropping that one down to your challenge and creating a more challenging objective for your aspirational objective. Likewise, the same might be said if you had a really low ability class. Your Aspire challenge might become to identify the main ideas and concepts, and you might have a more appropriate challenge objective there. So please take ownership of the Aspire and Challenge. You've got to make them fit for purpose, and they've got to be appropriate for the pupils that are in front of you. All lessons follow the 6-part structure, and they all include a collaborative task. Now, these lessons were planned pre-COVID, so every academy has came up with the collaborative tasks that they are using. So please, you're going to have to adapt those to make it appropriate to fit your classroom at the moment. Also, I would just like to say, when I was planning this, I tried to make sure that I used every collaborative structure at least once. If one collaborative structure doesn't work for you in your class, just because it's on the scheme doesn't mean that you've got to do it. Take ownership of that and make it more appropriate, switch it for another one. And the third thing that I'd like to draw your attention to are the key questions at the bottom of every lesson. Now, these should be woven throughout your teaching and learning dialogue with your class. And you can see that they are RAG rated, and the question at the top matches the aspirational objective and is the most sophisticated question to answer. So for lesson 1, really basic question, are the soldiers powerful or powerless? I would be expecting all pupils to be able to answer that. But through my questioning, I would then also follow the pale structure. Oh, well, can you give me evidence for that? Can you explain that quotation? How does it show the soldiers as powerless? The next question is, Well, if these soldiers are powerless, what do the soldiers lose in the conflict? What part of their identity? And again, it links back to the conceptual ideas from the phased content. And then finally, what are the soldiers corrupted by? Is it something external to them, or is it something internal to them? And these questions again build on each other within the lesson, but also draw on previous ideas, conceptual ideas, but also skills and knowledge from Term 1A, but also from Year 7. So this section is all about giving you a detailed overview of one example poem from the Year 8 scheme that links with a poem that our pupils will study in Year 9 onwards. So the first core poem that is taught throughout this scheme is Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. So contextually, it's obviously written from World War I, from an eyewitness account and perspective, and it's really, really important that Wilfred Owen is immortalised as the poet who actually brought the true horrors and the graphic reality of World War I to life, and really contrasted with the British propaganda that surrounded people at home. And this was an eyesight into what it was actually really, really like. The poem is full of really graphic imagery, and it really emphasises how powerless these soldiers are. So the first line, bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through the sludge. Straight away we've got those really powerful similes, the adjectives, but also the verb. We cursed through sludge, and we've got this conflict between these soldiers who are supposed to be masculine, physically powerful, in contrast with these incredibly difficult environmental issues, the sludge, the power of nature, and so forth. On its simplest form, and you'll see these within the lesson, I think it's lesson 2, or it might be it's actually lesson 1, I think. So in its most simplest form, this poem deals with power, conflict and friendship. Digging a little bit deeper, you can also explore with your pupils, well, what do these soldiers lose? What are the consequences on these soldiers of this conflict? Not just the physical consequences, but the emotional and psychological consequences, as stated in the phased content of the medium-term plan. So again, you've got that onion approach. It's multi-layered. And for your real high ability, you really want to talk about the corruptive nature of conflict, the morality behind conflict. Was it right for our young men to be experiencing this? And talking about the insignificance of mankind within an establishment, but also in comparison to the power of nature. All of those ideas that are evident in Dulce et Decorum Est are also evident in Wilfred Owen's exposure. If we take the first line there, our brains ache in the merciless ice-east winds that knife us. It reminds us of the opening of Dulce et Decorum Est. We're again presented immediately with the intense power of nature, the merciless ice-east winds that knife us, in comparison to the soldiers in Dulce et Decorum Est cursing through sludge. We've also got the idea of psychological consequences on our soldiers. Our brains ache, and the collective identity of the soldiers in exposure is also linked to the collective pronouns of we in Dulce et Decorum Est. So it's no coincidence that the poems that our pupils study in years 7 and 8 lead to the poems that they will ultimately study in year 9 to 11. And that's just a little bit of an insight into that for you. I've also included a a couple of poems that move away from a physical actual conflict but move towards exploring the idea of power over people. So Flag by John Agard is in the Year 8 scheme, and it is a poem that presents power over people, an abuse of power. Again, all ideas that our pupils have been exposed to throughout Year 7, but also last term within the play Othello. It also presents the consequences of a conflict. So this poem builds on ideas that pupils have been exposed to in week 1, in Dulce Decorum Est, but it also moves towards ideas of objectification and again dealing with the big idea of morality. Is it right that a piece of cloth brings a nation to its knees? Is patriotism something that should be valued or criticised? Does it blind young soldiers? And again, there are direct links between John Agard's Flag to John Agard's Checking Out My History, the main one being an establishment abusing its power, resulting in immoral behaviour towards an individual, and an individual feeling like they are insignificant. So this whole idea in Checking Out My History that John Agard felt that he was blinded to his own identity, just like the young men in Flag have been blinded by their patriotism. There are conceptual links between every single one. And the whole scheme is built on the fact that as the pupils work through the weeks and work through the poems, their confidence, their knowledge, their analytical skill of these concepts develops. And in doing so, they're exposed to a multitude of big ideas and are able to express those big ideas in their own voice. So the scheme is 6 weeks long, based on 4 lessons a week. Now, term 1B is actually 7 weeks long, so it does give you an additional week under the assumption that there is enough in the scheme and that there will be opportunities where you will need to address a skill set within your class that I haven't been able to anticipate. Now, the final week builds up to pupils being able to be exposed to and confidently explain and analyse unseen poetry. Now, the second lesson goes through the process of looking and working an unseen poem, again based on using those conceptual links as a way into the poem. And the poems that I've chosen for this session are Hughes's 6 Young Men and Tennyson's War. Now again, if those poems aren't appropriate, feel free to choose another couple of poems from the Year 8 Poetry Anthology. So as well as analysing poetry, analysing unseen poetry, there are also opportunities within the scheme for writing to be developed as well. Argumentative writing, there's a whole week on that. Looking at non-fiction texts. So on the surface, this is a scheme where you might look at and think, oh, for the next 6 weeks I'm doing poetry. But you're not, you're doing a lot more. And that brings us to the end of the overview of the Year 8 Term 1B Poetry Scheme. So I'm really hoping that you're now feeling confident with regards to what the scheme looks like, how you actually break the scheme down and how it's linked together. And remember that metaphoric onion. It's a layered approach and everything is there because it links on to something else. Please remember that poems are just texts. They're not to be feared. And please use these poems as vehicles for knowledge and skills. You can't go into this scheme just thinking, I'm teaching poetry for the next 6 weeks. You're not. You're teaching a lot more. And please remember, to make links back to Term 1A, reading specific skills, peel paragraph structures, but also conceptual ideas, and bring those forward. There are multiple occasions in the actual lessons where I have made explicit boxes to link it back to the Othello scheme. But also please link back to Year 7 poetry and bring in those ideas and those key questions that draw it all together. Because like I said at the beginning, the Net English curriculum, it is this spiral and everything is connected. And that brings us to the end of this overview. I hope that you have found this useful. My email address is displayed on this slide, so please feel free to drop me an email if you've got any additional questions, if you require any additional support, if you want to share some good practice. I'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm sure you'll hear from me soon.